now in regards to that. And now I'll introduce our speakers. Adrian Charney is a professor in the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. His research focuses on the evaluation of programs aimed at convicted terrorists and individuals identified as at risk of radicalization. And Emma Belton is a PhD candidate and senior research assistant in the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland. Her research aims to improve understanding relating to the backgrounds and risk factors associated with individuals who have been convicted of terrorist offense or identified as having radicalized violent extremism. Adrian, you can go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, thanks, Erin, and hello, everybody. First of all, thanks to Erin and Start for organising this presentation. So today we're going to talk about this PIRA dataset. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge the fact that this piece of research and this dataset is being funded by an Australian Research Council Future Fellowship. So I will outline PIRA, and yes, PIRA is a replication of the PIRAS data set that many of you may be familiar with. However, I have to make the proviso, it's not a strict replication, and I'll go into how that is the case. We are going to provide a snapshot of some preliminary early results. The aim here is not to compare with PIRAS, but we will eventually do that. We do have a very much a smaller sample size compared to the PIRAS data set, as you'll see. But really, that's the nature of the problem here in Australia. We have a smaller problem, say, compared to Europe or the US in the context of the number of individuals who are radicalised, who have joined terrorist groups, who have committed a terrorist act. And that's a result of our geographical location, our population, etc. But our sample size is much smaller, and that does limit the types of analysis we can do. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the obvious limitations with this data set with PIRA, and which is basically a result of the fact we are drawing on open source materials to develop the individual profiles, and there are of course limitations with that compared to, say, closed sources. Just to make you aware, I mean, developing the profiles of individual radicalisation in Australia dataset is part of a larger project around CVE interventions and developing metrics, and also part of looking at risk factors for radicalisation and identifying the implications of interventions. And of course, Emma, who will speak in a minute, is doing a PhD on the PIRA dataset, which fits into that program of research, and she's doing a lot of work as well in many aspects of that particular larger project. So PIRA itself, we have chosen to select individuals for inclusion in PIRA. We had to make a choice around a start date, and we selected 1985 onwards. We acknowledge that many of you may be aware there were terrorist attacks prior to 1985, such as the Hilton Hotel bombing, etc. But from our analysis and our scrutiny of the available sources, it wasn't really until 1985 onwards when you would actually be able to begin to identify specific individuals within open source materials connected to terrorist plots or individuals who had radicalised. And so we decided that from 1985 to 2020 is our inclusion date. And that's because basically the availability of sources. We are starting a little bit later compared to where PIRA does. Of course, in developing these profiles within PIRA, we are drawing upon open source materials. So we draw upon media reports and court transcripts, and a lot of our profiles have been based on court transcripts. And if you're aware of the detail in court transcripts here in Australia, it is quite startling the amount of material that is recorded. We are not subject to the same sorts of privacy provisions that, say, countries in Europe are. So when we go to court transcripts, we are getting a lot of material out of those transcripts to develop the profiles. We also look at parliamentary inquiries, parliamentary reports to identify individuals, some overseas research organisations like the Middle Eastern Media Research Institute as well. So we're drawing upon a raft of open sources. Yes, PIRA is a replication of the US PIRA dataset. but we have had to modify it to the Australian context, such as around how we have defined criminal offences is different here in the US, sorry, is different here in Australia compared to the US. And yes, there is a code book developed as well on PIRA, which we're continuing updating and will be made available. We are coding for variables across 122 different types of factors, a little bit larger than PIRAS, canvassing background, demographics, group affiliation, and contextual information. So within PIRA, we have some additional variables we've included, such as history of violence, which you'll see in a minute, with the verbal, physical violence, or history of domestic violence. We have named extremist connections. We look at intergroup and outer group connections within the sample. We've collected additional variables around legislative provisions, such as whether the individual has been subject to a control order or if they're a jihadi bride. So who's included? Well, our inclusion criteria matches very closely to PIRAS. So it's individuals espousing Islamist, far right, far left, or single issue ideologies, committing ideological motivated illegal, violent or non-violent acts, joining a terrorist group, or associating with an extremist group, whether informal or formal in a sense. So who is eligible? So this is our inclusion criteria. The individual has to have radicalised while living in Australia. There is evidence that they previously or currently espouse ideological motivations. And then there is evidence within the sources that their behaviours are linked to the ideological motives they espouse. Now, with that last inclusion criteria, that's pretty easy when it comes to an individual who's been charged for a terrorist offence. But PIRA includes individuals who are simply radicalised, who have not been charged for a terrorist offence. So this could be, for example, someone who has committed an armed robbery, has been charged for a normal criminal offence connected to that armed robbery, but those funds have been sent overseas to fund terrorist group, or individuals they may have committed the robbery were also involved in some types of radicalised behaviour. So that's an example of that last point. So our sample size and our approach to coding, I'll just give you some information on that. So to date, we've identified 247 individuals in the data set. And in a minute, I'm going to show you some results, some demographic backgrounds, and Emma will go into some more detail about some other factors associated with that sample. Now, not all those individuals have been coded for as of yet. We're still going through that. We have a smaller team who is going through coding this data. Now, our approach to coding is that, in a sense, we have two types of data set. We take all the sources for each individual and we first code those sources. Sorry, we first code the variables qualitatively across those sources. We capture all the data qualitatively for each individual across the various variables. Then the process is that we then transform that data into various dichotomous and numerical indicators that allow for analysis. So essentially we have two data sets. We have a qualitative data set on each individual and we have a quantitative data set that matches a lot of variables in PIRAS, many of them the same, but some additional ones. The benefit of this is that it allows for some in-depth individual case studies, as well as looking at some statistical analysis. And this has been quite useful in our research. Our approach to coding, I suppose the best way to describe it is that it's a consensus-based approach to coding. So there's a team of people. Emma is in charge of managing PIRA and she manages a small team of RAs. They go through their allocated individuals and they go through the different sources and they start to code, etc. And if there is a problem with the coding process, they defer to Emma. And then Emma will have a discussion with me. We'll come to a consensus, perhaps how a variable will be coded, okay? And then that's the process that is followed. So it's very much a consensus-based approach, but we have, and we will begin to take a random selection of cases and test the intercoder reliability, such as running Krippendorfs, etc., just to make sure we have, our coding is valid in the sense of it being consistent. So we are beginning to do that. Okay, of course, we acknowledge, like with any open source data set, there is missing data, is a limitation. Okay, so a recent newspaper we published that some of you may be aware of, across the 33 participants, we had just over 13% of missing data for the 23 variables we utilised. For the 202 cases that we draw on here in this presentation, we have just over 17.5% of missing data across the 122 variables. Now, when myself and Emma goes into presenting this data, we haven't compensated for that missing data because we're only basically going to be reporting descriptives. But many of you might be shocked that that percentage of missing data is quite low. Okay, there's a couple of reasons we can explain for this. One, you've got to keep in mind that a number of individuals in our data set have been charged for terrorist offences. So there's a lot of information in open sources in court transcripts about them. Also, we've been able to cross-reference across cases. So individual may be given a pseudonym, but we can actually cross-reference to another case reported in court transcripts. We're able to pick up information on those individuals. The other thing you've got to be aware of is that we have set some strict rules around certain variables, particularly dichotomous variables, where if there isn't, for example, if you look at mental illness, etc., if there isn't a reported clinical diagnosis or some self-reported evidence of a mental health problem, we default to no evidence rather than missing. So we've set some strict variables, etc. So we have tried to minimise the level of missing data in the data set by adopting these types of approaches. But again, we have the benefit of a large amount of information being out there on court transcripts. So let's go in to looking at some of the demographics and some of the background information of our sample. So they're predominantly male, very gendered. The average age is 27, between 14s. We have some of young as 14 years old in our data set to as old as 54, but the average age is 27. So we are talking about a rather youthful sample. The majority of the individuals included in PIRA are born in Australia. Very few immigrants are included in our data set. Just over 57% categorised as having low educational achievement. That is, they've only completed high school or lower. Okay, few gone on to university. And what we found is that just over 29% of these did not finish high school. And then when you actually begin to delve into the cases, particularly for the youth within our sample, many of them dropped out of high school when they were radicalising. 32.7% had regular, consistent employment, but a vast majority did not. Just under half within our sample were married, and this is either civil or religious. And again, when you begin to drill down on the individual cases, you actually find that many of the individual's partners were radicalising with them or co-radicalising, or were fairly indifferent to their partner's radicalisation. And what we find is that many fall within the category of having low to middle class backgrounds, 93%. So they're not a hugely well off group of individuals that are included within this particular sample, PIRA sample. Remember, we're talking about 202 individuals, not the full 247. So what about some historical characteristics of these individuals? Well, just under 30% we find suffered some type of mental illness, and that's a particularly high ratio for youth. When I talk about youth, I'm talking about teens and preteens. We also find under 30% or so had some type of trauma. Now, this is witnessing violence in the home, witnessing a death of a loved one, witnessing deaths in overseas conflict. We find a history of alcohol and drug use within the sample. Now, this is illicit drug use or abuse. And that's quite surprising when you'll see in a minute a large percentage of our group are of Muslim background. We also see characteristics, just over 20% of those have a history of violence, whether it's committing physical or verbal violence. Now, we did include history of violence for another reason, because there's a lot of speculation within the literature that many individuals who radicalise have a predisposition of exhibiting violence against women. And so we were trying to capture that within our sample. However, we find we've got under 4% only had that type of history of any type of history of violence against women. And we also have a very small percentage, this is much smaller, so for example, compared to PIRA, where had some type of military training, whether here in Australia or overseas. That's just to give you a snapshot of some of the background characteristics of our sample. Now I'll hand over to Emma to continue on with some of more detailed information about our sample while I'll then return to concluding.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. We're very straightforward. My puppy last night chewed my glasses, so I'm a bit blind at the moment, but I'll do what I can with what I've got. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about, what the data is starting to look like, some trends that we're seeing that are starting to emerge, and trying to get into sort of a bit more of the nitty gritty with some very preliminary analyses and statistics here. So the first thing we sort of try to do in PIRA as well as PIRAs is we're looking at the difference between those that engage in violent extremist behaviours and those that engage in non-violent extremist behaviours. So you can see here that a large majority of our sample are engaged in violent behaviours. Now, violent behaviours don't necessarily mean that the individuals, succeeded in committing a terrorist offence. That does include these people, obviously. So when we look at things like terrorist cells committing domestic attacks, suicide bombings, we don't have a lot of those here. We don't have a lot of successful terrorist attacks, which is not a bad thing. But in the sense, we do have a very small amount that are successful in causing casualties or causing harm to others. But also included in this category of violent motivation is those that intended to and were maybe disrupted or stopped, usually by authority. So this happens a lot in Australia where we have smaller cells that plot some sort of extremist event or terrorist event, and they are apprehended prior to executing that attack. So these people also fall into that category. Within the non-violent category, we're looking at people that are not intending or they're not motivated by violence. So they do things like they might be part of an extremist organisation, but predominantly they're doing things like funding and material support. This also includes people that had terrorist training but didn't enact upon it. We have a couple of people in here that did things like arson, but that was in the middle of the night and there was no harm or intent to harm other people. So those are also categorized into that non-violent. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this a little bit later about some predictors of violence, but I'll do that a little bit later. And so what else you can see here is that in Australia, we are very much leaning towards those that adhere to an Islamist ideology. We don't really have a lot of far left or single issue. In fact, single issue, we have, I think, 2 at the moment. So we're very much leaning heavily towards that Islamist or, Al-Qaeda inspired or ISIS inspired sort of individuals. We are seeing a trend of far right white supremacy in Australia. Particularly, I'll give you an example in a second, in that the individuals are coming more to fruition and engaging in more violent behaviour. So if we look at the next point here, within our sample so far, half of them have been charged for a terrorist offence or charged or convicted. So in some cases, these charges were dropped, but in the majority of the cases, they were eventually convicted of a terrorist offence. Now, up until last Monday, all of these individuals adhered to the Islamist ideology. Last Monday, an 18-year-old white supremacist was charged with a terrorist offence, but that is the first instance in Australia to date. So that's quite interesting, and that, it's not, it sort of makes sense that, most of the ideologies draw towards that way, and then obviously, evidently, most terrorist offences are related to that type of ideology. We do have a couple of new variables, which Adrian did touch on, that we've added to PIRA, and one of these is lone actors. So we've added a variable in there that is essentially measuring or capturing how many individuals did in fact act alone. These include, suicide bombers, those that carry out isolated attacks with no help from others, In some cases in Australia, we do have a couple of isolated dyads where there'll be two individuals, usually quite young individuals under the age of 18, that will carry out these violent attacks and with no connections to other extremist groups or no known connections outside the two of them. So we have 28 of those so far. And we also have about 31% of our sample are foreign fighters. Now, we do also know that this number is actually a lot greater. So reports say anywhere between 150 and 200 individuals in Australia have fled overseas to engage in foreign fighting with an extremist organisation. But this is information we've captured on people that we know their names and a little bit more information about them. So there isn't a lot of information on foreign fighters in Australia, but this is what we have captured so far. Now, looking a little bit further into social influences and social dynamics of radicalised individuals in Australia, we see that about 43% are a member of a formal extremist organisation. Now, a formal extremist organisation is organisations that essentially are terrorist groups. So, things like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, those very big, formalised, designated terrorist organisations. Now, in PIRA, and as well I believe in PIRAS, is that membership is defined quite loosely. So if there is enough reports or information that we believe the individual either self-adheres to being a member of a group, or there is information of ties or connections to a formal group, they are coded as being a member. I'll talk a little bit more about membership a little bit later on as well. We also do see, and this is something that is very dominant in Australia, is individuals being part of a clique. And a clique is essentially an exclusive, isolated group of individuals with at least two or more people. Think of it like a group of friends. So people that hang out together all the time, they essentially don't let outsiders in, and these other members are as well radicalised or part of extremist groups. We're seeing that a large majority of our sample are part of these little cliques. And interestingly enough, we're seeing a lot of connections between these cliques, even across state lines. As well as that, we are seeing that there's a relatively higher prevalence of individuals that have a radical family member. So this is a direct family member. So this isn't aunties and uncles. This is brothers and sisters and parents. More often than not, it is siblings. So we see that siblings tend to radicalise together, or in a lot of cases, the older siblings will start recruiting their younger siblings. And in addition to that, we're also seeing that a fair few have radical significant others. So this isn't that they're married. It could just be that they're in a relationship with someone, but essentially we're seeing that this is a very influencing factor in that either one individual will seek out a radical significant other, or that individual will radicalise their significant other. So there seems to be quite a mix there. And in a couple of cases in Australia, one particularly, there was a couple that actually planned a terrorist attack together. So there seems to be quite an influence there. And the last point I'll make before I move on is the influence of social media. So we obviously know that social media plays quite a big role in radicalisation. In Australia, it's about 70% of the sample we know have had some sort of influence, or there's some sort of driver through social media, whether that's engaging in extremist content, disseminating content, talking to other radical individuals, or connecting with extremist groups. But we are seeing that it tends to not be the only influencer. So we measure this as a way of either it's the primary influencer or it's an influencer along with other things. So we're seeing more so that social media on its own isn't responsible for a lot of the radicalisation in Australia. And it's a combination between that and a few other things, which I'll talk about now. So I'm going to go over these essentially catalysts that we're seeing and trends that seem to be emerging within our data. So the first thing I'll talk about is the presence of a significant event. So what this is essentially is something where an individual, there's a certain thing that happens at a time that seems to accelerate or predispose someone and to their radicalisation. So I haven't actually listed what these are here because there is quite a lot of them, but some of your really classic ones is things like 9/11 or the emergence of the Islamic State, or things like the Assad regime. So you see a lot of individuals really talking to those events and talking about how much it influenced them and how much it played a big role in their trajectories into extremism. We've actually added a couple that we found sort of kept coming up, and those are events that generated grievances. And we see this a lot in the sense that people will talk about how when their house was raided, or when they were apprehended by police, or when they were stopped at the airport, or when friends and family members were interrogated by authorities, we're seeing that this is a really big accelerator in the radicalisation in Australia. Because of those close-knit groups, we're seeing that there's so much connection that when people are feeling more targeted, it's really pushing that trajectory there. And as you see, there's 86% that have talked about, or we've identified that have had some sort of significant event occur. Radicalisation place. So this essentially is talking about the risk of exposure. So whether individuals were in a certain place that heightened their risk of exposure to extremism or radicalisation. And as you'll see there, in a lot of instances, it was a place of worship. So as Adrian did say, a lot of our sample are Muslim and identify as being Muslim, which essentially infers that they do attend mosques. Now, interestingly, at this point is there seems to be a group of mosques. So it's not just any mosque, it's essentially these places of worship are hotspots, and that there'll be 4 or 5 that essentially people gravitate towards, where they're either first exposed to the extremist ideology or teachings or preachers, and that really is a stepping stone for them. We see a lot of individuals parts of social clubs, so like soccer clubs or sporting facilities, where they'll start interacting with others that share the same beliefs as them. There's some instance where individuals went to the same school, and those that seem to be their exposure place. And there's others, so things like our workplace and things like that. So moving on to grievances. So we do see a lot of this, and even within all our ideologies here, individuals tend to infer about grievances. So that is that they themselves or the group that they associate with or identify with feel threatened or persecuted, or that they've suffered some sort of injustice. And we're seeing that 80% of information that we do have seems to come up in that they feel targeted, especially Muslims. So we talk about things like, the war on terror is the war against Muslims, and that authorities are unfairly targeting them. And we're also seeing actually more recently far-right individuals saying things like the Australian culture is being sheltered and we're not allowed to express ourselves anymore, and they're talking about those types of grievances. So we do see that quite a lot in Australia. So earlier, I did talk very briefly about that dichotomy between violent and non-violent extremism, and that's essentially us we're trying to compare of those who were radicalised, who escalated to violence and who didn't, or who engaged in violence and who didn't, or violent motivations or intentions. So this was an analysis that I ran a couple of days ago, so it's very preliminary and it's very early on, but I thought it was interesting, and I thought it would be something that you all would hopefully find interesting. So within the sample, about 54 of the individuals were actively recruited. So they were recruited, they were sought out, they were targeted by often extremist or terrorist groups. And I found that essentially those that were actively recruited were more likely to engage in violence, and they were more likely to engage in violent behaviour than those that weren't. And we see that a lot of those that were recruited by associates or members of terrorist groups, and in fact family members was quite high in there as well, based on relatively small numbers. We also found as well that being a member of an extremist group did predict violence as well. Now, the membership of an extremist group can be the formal one, so things like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but it can also be an informal group, so a group or a cell that has formed in a homegrown sense. And we also have a few that were a part of an above ground political activist group. Not so much, but we do find that this membership talks a lot to violence and those violent motivations, which I thought was quite interesting. And the last thing I'll briefly talk about with you guys is some research that I presented at ASC last year. You guys remember ASC, how nice it was to go and see people and do things not behind a screen. So last year, I essentially did a replication study on Gary Lafree and his colleagues' work that was looking at criminological predictors and whether they could actually predict violent extremism, and drawing on theories such as social learning and social control and other really stock standard predictors that we see in criminology like age and gender. Now, this table won't make a lot of sense to you right now, but essentially all that's trying to show you is the predictors that were tested. So things like marital status, were they part of a radical group, gender, what was their employment like? And so I replicated their study, which had about 1,400 cases and I used one with only 70 because at the time, unfortunately, that's all the cases that we had. So upon running that replication, it was found that only gender seemed to be a significant predictor of extremist violence. Again, this is maybe likely to the fact that sample size was so small. I'm hoping to actually run this again when we finish our data collection to see, because I believe Gary's study found a large majority of these variables did in fact predict violence. So, however, interestingly enough, even though we didn't find anything of similarity there, what I did find is I ran a cluster analysis using these predictors, so the predictors listed here. And what I found was that these predictors can actually delineate and determine essentially where individuals fall in between three different groups, which is what those names are up the top there, which I'll explain to you now. But what was interesting is these predictors actually put people in these very specific groups, and these specific groups had very identifiable characteristics, which I'll talk to you about now. So I named it the 3Ds because I think I'm pretty clever and pretty witty. And essentially these 3Ds they're the dedicated, the deadly, and the disguised. So using those criminological predictors, what happened is these groups were formed, right? So I'll talk about them a little bit. The names do mean something. So the dedicated group, which made up the majority of the sample. So keep in mind, this was only a sample of 70. But the dedicated group essentially consisted of people that were leaders. So leaders of terrorist organizations or terrorist groups. We had recruiters. So a lot of high-level recruiters in Australia that are known to have recruited over, 10 to 20 individuals were in this group. They were really organized. They were very patient. They tended to be older, married, a little bit more socially stable in a way. They had commitments. They often had children, and they had higher levels of education. So this made up about half of the sample there. And they all seem to engage in the same type of behaviors as well. So moving on from there, there's the deadly group. And this is exactly what you think it is. It's because these individuals often successfully executed attacks in Australia where casualties or harm actually happened. And as I said earlier, these attacks are very rare, but when they did happen, all of the individuals within the sample fell into this group. And this group made up a lot of the lone actors or the smaller isolated groups. So individuals who were plotting really large scale domestic attacks, or individuals who engaged in lone actor attacks. So we had a couple of stabbings in 2017 by 2 young men, so they fell into this category. And the individuals in here were often very young. So the average age was actually 21 in this group, and for the dedicated, the average age was 27, so they're a little bit older. Not a lot of history of education, kind of makes sense because of the age as well. And there was a higher prevalence of mental illness within the group. And the last group was called the disguised group because it just really didn't make any sense, the people that were in this group, in the sense that there was no evidence, or, their radicalization was almost like a surprise. There was no history of them communicating with radical groups. There was no precipitating event. There was no grievances, and all of a sudden they'd get up and, fly to Syria, or they'd start engaging with other radical groups. And this group was often recruited. And the group was often female as well, which was really interesting, but they tended to not have a lot of associates or radical peers. So these groups I thought were very interesting in the fact that, the criminological predictors we see from social learning and social control could actually put people in these groups using those. And I hope to do this again when we're finished, but I think it's also interesting to see that, these predictors can be used in certain ways, and hopefully this will be able to carry on with this type of research. But that's all from me, and thank you for listening.
Okay, all right, thanks. Thanks, Emma. So now, just to finish off, so in conclusion, so if you look at some of this preliminary, it's very preliminary analysis, there's a lot more work to be done, a lot more cleaning of the sample, etc. But there does appear to be some key vulnerabilities within the sample. And some of those, you look at some of those background factors, and some of those, if you look at the criminological literature, are quite similar to general criminality. But it is a highly gendered sample. But again, as we've tried to indicate, females seem to play some key roles, particularly within those networks and those relationships. Yes, it's dominantly Islamist, Muslim radicalisation. And if you look in particular, there was an uptick from 2014 in relation to youth radicalisation within our sample. Yes, we acknowledge, while small in relation to the case of far right, there has, as Emma indicated, there have been some recent examples of far right activity, and again, the 18-year-old more recently been charged with a terrorist offence, but it's still a very small end within the sample itself. You see very strongly the influence of social networks and clique having a major role within our sample, whether you're talking about actual nodes or places, etc., or people. Yes, social media use and influence is evident. Active use, no doubt about it, it exists, and the data indicates that. But as Emma said, it's really those personal connections and face-to-face interaction that seem to be the stronger catalysts. As we indicated, there appears to be nodes or places that are linked to radicalisation within our sample. There seems to be almost this sort of geography to radicalisation as such, which I know some people in the UK have been looking at. We see significant events associated with radicalisation in the sample, particularly either around a event or a series of events. So you can talk about a tipping point to some degree. We're not saying you're able to predict with certainty what this tipping point might be or when it might occur, but it definitely exists. The issues of grievances is very strong amongst the sample, particularly this sense of injustice is quite strong. The question I would raise, and has been argued in the literature, is this a risk factor or cause of radicalisation, or is this grievance simply, or a sense of injustice, simply an outcome of individuals' associations within the group? Very briefly, if you look at the implications for prevention at this data, yes, you need to look at certain vulnerabilities around mental health, some of those background characteristics, looking at disrupting those social networks, and given the strong role of social work networks, intergroup connections, associations, etc., particular nodes, those connections, that finding really highlights the important roles of what third parties can play in early intervention. So what next? Of course, you want to complete the PIRA data set. We need to look more closely at the risk factors and correlates. We will be doing some comparative analysis with PIRAs. And one of our aims is actually expand the data set to include specific 2R variables, so we can do some testing of the applicability of the PIRA 2R, which is endorsed and used in Australia quite extensively. Use some of those indicators in the PIRA 2R to see their applicability to a large data set like PIRA. So that's all. That's us for now. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you both. First, everyone, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to Understanding Youth Radicalization and Analysis of Australian Data, which is the PIRA team's journal article that they published using preliminary data from PIRA. And next, as a reminder, you're welcome to drop any questions you have in the Q&A. I can't promise we'll get through all of them, but we're going to do the best we can. So our first question is, our first couple of questions are some questions about your methodology. Our first question is that the sources that you partly pulled from were court transcripts. Are these full transcripts of court cases that you sought through the courts, or are these judges' sentencing comments sourced online?
So most of the court transcripts that we have access to, in a couple of cases, we do sort of ask for these. So we do request the court transcripts, but in a lot of cases in Australia, we find that even the preliminary cases and the judgments made early on are made available to the public. So in some instances, we have cases where there's 9, 10 or 11 court transcripts available on individuals. And often it is sentencing transcripts, but in saying that, we do have a lot of access and they are quite thorough, and we don't generally have a lot of issue finding them. And even if we do, and we do request them, they're very easily attainable that way.
But it isn't the only source. I mean, while it's a dominant source, it's not the only source.
Sure.
Yeah,
thank you.
Adrian's right.
How did you define mental illness? Did you do it by diagnosis or an awareness of diagnosis?
So mental illness within the code book that we've created, essentially mental illness incorporates any sort of psychiatric illness, encompassing, if you want to use the DSM as an example, any type of mental illness that would be, designated in there. And it usually comes from a professional diagnosis from a clinician. That's probably about 85% of the cases that we see. It's very rare that we'll diagnose a mental illness based on, pure speculation from news articles or anything like that. It's often something that's very heavily reported on with very specific diagnoses intact. We do have information on the specifics of those mental illnesses in our qualitative data set, but in and of itself, it is quite a broad term, I would say. Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, we have to acknowledge the limitations with coding for mental illness from open sources because of the nature of the information available. That's just something you confront with using these types of data.
Sure, thank you. Our next question is from the primary investigator of PIRA, actually, and Mike Jensen, and he says, great job, you guys. In PIRA, we've noticed a couple of recent trends, including a general acceleration of the radicalization process, which we think is likely driven by social media and the echo chamber effect it produces. Did you try to measure the duration of radicalization, which he defines as the time from first exposure to extremist content to attack or arrest for your subjects, and have you noticed a similar trend?
I'll take this one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, actually we have, interestingly enough. So we measure duration, in fact, the same way that you do, where we look at the first instance of radical behaviours to the time of exposure or attack or whatever incident it might be. And we're finding that the older cases, it's generally the radicalisation is a much longer process. So we tend to categorise those into either short, which is sort of under a year, and you've got that medium, which is between 1 and 5 years, or then in some cases even longer than that. But from about 2015 or 14 onwards, we're seeing that these the trajectories are very quick, and the acceleration is very quick, and often the social media tends to be a major player in that, and those social connections and contacts that we're seeing. So yes, we're definitely seeing something very, very similar from based on what I've looked at in the data very, briefly.
Great, thank you. For our next question is, so some of your findings around clicks, social influence, and networks suggest that social network analysis holds some promise, not only in more clearly understanding social processes, but also determining potential interventions. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's true. We haven't done any social network analysis as yet. For our youth paper, we looked at intergroup and outer-group connections. And within that paper, it's very strong amongst the youth within the sample. So we found a high percentage of youth, young teens and preteens in that sample had a large percentage of knew each other, and also had a percentage of outer-group connections with known adults who had radicalised. So we haven't taken it to social network analysis. We can definitely do it with the data we're collecting. In relation to interventions, yes, there is implications around a number of things. One is disrupting networks, but I suppose this issue of creating opportunities for individuals to make pro-social connections outside of the groups they're tending to socialise or hang out with. And I think that's why I pointed to this role of third parties in that final slide.
Yeah, I would agree with Adrian there. I think the findings around clicks and social influence is one of our most dominant factors that we see across the board. And even in the cases where individuals are, you know, quote unquote alone, we do see that there is a huge influence through either social media or other places that are driving that radicalization and those types of behaviors.
Sure.
Oh, just one final comment, I suppose, that the concerning finding for us is the role of family members and significant others. I mean, particularly if these individuals are radicalising within the family context, we actually find that finding quite concerning. Either two things happening: either family members are indifferent to the individual's radicalisation, or they're facilitating it. And in the context of creating pro-social behaviour, we know within criminology that's not a good outcome. So that's particularly something that we find pretty concerning.
Actually, yeah, on that note, Adrian, what is also more concerning is that aspect of recruitment. And what we're finding is that family members are often, in some senses, marrying off their siblings to other extremist, their extremist friends. So what we're seeing is like families starting to sort of interlay and like overlap with each other, where they're creating more connections and more solid connections like marriage, and then building on these. So we're seeing it's growing from a very intimate place, which, yes, is very concerning.
Right, that is concerning. Would either of you, oh, excuse me, would either of you have any recommendations for those organizations that are concerned with either counterterrorism or countering violent extremism, whether they're with law enforcement or more grassroots organization that might be considering violent extremism in their community?
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of takeaways. I mean, one is around some of those key vulnerabilities and creating particular resilience to the influence of others. I think another issue is around pro-social activities and creating opportunities in which individuals are not exposed as much to radicalised networks. I mean, this is easier said than done, I'd have to admit that, in the context of sorts of interventions that arise. But the other thing as well is this issue around perceived grievances and injustices. I think there's a role there for reversing and tackling the sorts of narratives that reinforce those feelings. So there are a couple of the things I would suggest. So Emma,
I was going to say, I think the thing that concerns in relation to practitioners and law enforcement is that it's obviously very difficult to tackle, and especially when you're looking at things like social media and trying to contain that. And because we're seeing, that upward trend in those social dynamics, it's almost really hard to target what we think are some of the triggers or some of the really higher risks of exposure and trying to reduce those. And I think it's the combination between those online and offline dynamics, and either trying to tackling it from one end or the other. Obviously on the ground, face-to-face is usually a bit harder to manage rather than online, but we're seeing that more in the interventions, like the interventions before individuals sort of engage in that behavior as they're trying to tackle that social media thing, which again is a lot easier said than done. But yeah, that's essentially all I have on that.
Absolutely. I don't imagine anyone has any secrets to fixing online radicalization.
That was a hard question.
That's okay. We don't expect you to have all the answers, just one or two of them. As a reminder, anyone, if you would like to drop a question in the Q&A, you are more than welcome to, but I'm also happy to just keep questioning them myself. So you mentioned before, kind of toward the end of your lecture, you mentioned some areas that you'd like to take PIRA in. Can you kind of go into more detail about what else you would like to do with it, how you would like to see it grow?
Yeah. So, I mean, the ultimate aim is to make it publicly available, have some sort of public interface similar to what exists with PIRAs. We will publish the code book. At some point, we need to stop in the context of the end date for the sample, which will mostly basically be when if there's no additional funding, when Emma finishes her PhD, because she's one of the main people working on the data set, even though I'm paying a small number of RAs as well. So that's where is to publish the code book, publish the data set to make it available, and create some sort of public interface with it. That's the ultimate goal here. Of course, one is to undertake some comparative analysis with PIRAs. We're aware there is interest in similar PIRAS replications in Canada, similar PIRAS replications in Europe. So if that goes ahead, this then offers an opportunity to some larger comparative analysis. I think there's a real great opportunity to do that, to do some larger comparative analysis across countries. And the final thing is, yeah, I think this data set with some modifications allows us to maybe do some testing around some of the risk assessment tools and really to understand whether some of the variables within the risk, identify when the risk assessment tools are applicable to certain populations. And that is something, as I mentioned, I want to do in adding, when we already have, you could say, we already have VIRA-like type indicators within PIRA in the sense of some of the variables, but to create some more specific variables to do some of that testing around the applicability of risk assessment tools to particular groups by using this data set.
The only thing I have to add is that's news to me, and I would like to finish this before my PhD is over. It's essentially just my life at the moment and has been for the past couple of years. But obviously the issue is of when to stop. And I think Adrian has a point there where it's, there's never going to be an instance where extremism stops happening. That would be really nice. But, it's going to have to get to a point where I put my foot down and go, I'm not adding any more people. We need to stop now and move on and add all those, as Adrian said, those variables and maybe sort of just fleshing out who we have and adding on to that. But yeah, that's all from my aspect anyway.
Sure. So we have another question in the Q&A. Can you talk more about the distinction between violent and nonviolent radicalization and how you've coded it? Are there any problems with it? Have you encountered any issues from it?
Yeah, so obviously that dichotomy is really hard to distinguish between. Obviously it would have been easier if it was just people that actually engaged in violence and those that didn't. But I think what this captures essentially is if our law enforcement wasn't so good, how many individuals would actually accelerate into that behavior. And so we've coded it in a way where violence essentially is, did the individual actively participate in, ideologically motivated behaviors or actions that resulted in casualties or injuries, or they intended to? So it was very clear from their behaviors and their planning and their plotting that that was going to be the end game. And there is obviously some issues with that when we look at things like, arson attacks or anything that is inherently violent. But if there's no evidence that violence was to actually hurt or kill anybody, we sort of try to put that in a way of, that is extremist behavior and it might in some sense be violent, but it wasn't violent in the sense of causing those real mass casualties or those sort of higher end of violence. And yeah, we do have some issues with the coding. So there is a lot of cases where I'll get some of the RAs and they'll sort of go, well, is this violent or non-violent, especially things like inciting violence. So when you have those high level recruiters, especially with the far right, we see that they're, inciting others to engage in violence. Now, we distinguish that in the sense that they themselves are not engaging in violence. And even though that in and of itself is a violent motivation, they would be coded as non-violent. So it is really hard to find. It's a bit of a gray area, but we try to make it so it's a very dichotomous way of dealing with it. And luckily we do have that more information when we're coding, those case studies to see how we've actually done that. So hopefully that answers your question.
There's been a lot of discussion about how we define and code this variable. And yeah, it is a bit tricky, and we've tried to do our best to delineate as sensibly as possible.
I think we don't have as many sort of, as you would call, especially not compared to the States, sort of non-violence. So we don't really have a lot of activism here in Australia. We don't have a lot of, vandalism or destruction or illegal protesting. So, I think that's also speaks to just being in Australia and it being quite different. So it's a lot harder to sort of flesh out those non-violent individuals because they're not as prevalent, and if they are, they're not very well heavily reported on. So usually we find that non-violence is characterized by funding or, you know, something of that manner. But yes, it is very difficult to code for.
I can certainly appreciate it. Back when we were still in the office, there were certainly plenty of arguments to be had about various codings on various projects. Was there anything, I have a question for you, was there anything that particularly surprised you about the data that you found, or that you find peculiar or interesting?
Good question.
My comment is, yeah, my only observation at the moment would be the influence of family and the fact that, you know, contrary to criminological literature, we find that some of these individuals, some, not all, come from stable family homes where they have close relationships with family members. So that was particularly for our youth sample, finding it with others. And that to me is quite surprising because it goes against a lot of the existing criminological literature around prosocial control, etc. That's the only comment I would make on that.
The thing that surprises me the most is it doesn't matter how many court transcripts I read or how much data I read or what I look into, it's that I always am quite surprised on these interpersonal connections that are coming through. So, you know, I'll be reading something about one individual who should have nothing to do with this group of individuals over here, and all of a sudden they're friends and they've spoken or they're related or whatever it might be, and it's becoming quite a big web of individuals that seem to be connected in some way or another, and then also finding that the organisation level of some of these extremist behaviours, particularly the violent ones, are becoming more sporadic and, weirdly enough, less informed by groups. So we're finding a very accelerated radicalisation to violence. But often those ones, there isn't a lot of social contact, which is weird. So there's lots of weird, not misconceptions. It's just lots of things that seem to not add up in a lot of cases, but then some are very, very clear. So it's interesting, and I think that the younger people that are engaging in this violence is probably the more concerning than interesting, and that they're sort of getting younger and younger, and the radicalisation is getting quicker and quicker.
Sure, thank you. I feel like my takeaway is that we haven't quite figured out why people radicalize, but we're going to keep working on it. And with that, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you both, Emma and Adrian, for joining us today. I think this was very informative.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for that. Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Of course. And thank you for our audience members for attending. If you'd like this event, you're interested in attending one of our future events, you're welcome to click the link that I just dropped in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful evening or day, depending on your time zone.
Thank you for all coming here at, I think it's 7 o'clock over there right now. So thank you, because I'm sure it's dinner time. So I appreciate that anyway.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.